In Salem, they say the church bells still ring every October night for a wedding that never happened and a bride who never stopped waiting. This is the true story of the Ghost Bride of Salem. Stay till the end. The final moment will haunt you forever. They say Salem never truly sleeps. Even centuries after the witch trials ended, its streets whisper secrets to those who listen closely. Locals tell stories of ghosts, curses, and souls that never found peace. But none are more haunting than the story of the Ghost Bride of Salem. It began in the winter of 1892, when a young woman named Eleanor Whitfield prepared for the happiest day of her life. Her family owned a grand Victorian mansion at the edge of Salem woods, a house painted in ivory and gold known as Whitfield Manor. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, Eleanor was to marry Thomas Gray, a sailor who had promised to return from sea just in time for their wedding. But that day never came. As the clock struck midnight, a storm rolled in from the coast. Thunder rattled the windows, and Eleanor stood in her wedding dress by the grand window waiting. Her father begged her to rest. Her mother wept quietly in the corner. But Eleanor refused to move. She said, "He promised me he'd come back. I'll wait even if it takes forever." The storm raged for 3 days. When it finally passed, the sea had claimed Thomas's ship. Every sailor was lost, or so they said. But Eleanor didn't believe it. She locked herself in her room, refusing food or light. She wrote love letters to Thomas every night and left them by the window. Locals claimed they saw a shadow of a man by that same window, even when the house was empty. Weeks turned into months. Then one night, Eleanor was found dead in her wedding gown, clutching a letter that read only one line: "Meet me at the altar when the clock strikes midnight." Her body was buried at Old Salem Cemetery, but strange things began to happen at Whitfield Manor soon after. At exactly midnight, the grand piano would play their wedding song by itself. The lights would flicker, and a faint smell of sea salt and roses filled the halls. Neighbors swore they saw a bride walking through the fog, her veil torn, her dress wet as if she had just come from the ocean. Years later, the mansion was abandoned. But ghost hunters, historians, and thrill seekers still came, drawn by the legend of the Ghost Bride of Salem. Some claim to have captured her voice on recording a woman whispering, "He's coming for me." One night, in 1998, a paranormal investigator named Daniel Hayes decided to spend the night inside the old mansion with his camera crew. He laughed off the stories until he found something strange. In the master bedroom, the walls were still covered in faint writing, letters written in blood that had turned brown with age. And every one of them said the same thing: "He's coming back." At midnight, Daniel's camera flickered. The temperature dropped. The piano began to play, slowly, painfully, the same wedding melody from 1892. Then, behind him, the sound of footsteps. A whisper, soft, trembling. "Do you believe in promises?" When Daniel turned, the camera caught a glimpse of a woman in white, her face pale and dripping with seawater. She reached out her hand, and the footage ended. The next morning, the police found Daniel's equipment, but Daniel himself was gone. Only one camera survived the storm that night, and it recorded a single frame before cutting out completely. A figure in a soaked wedding dress, smiling through tears, standing by the old window of Whitfield Manor, and behind her, just barely visible in the shadows, was the silhouette of a man in a sailor's coat, holding her hand. The Whitfield Manor stood silent for years after Daniel Hayes vanished. Locals avoided the woods near Salem, claiming they heard church bells at midnight, even though the nearest chapel had been abandoned for over a century. And sometimes, on stormy nights, people swore they saw a faint light inside the old house, as if someone was still waiting. It had been months since Daniel's disappearance when Clara Monroe, a historian from Boston University, decided to reopen the investigation. She specialized in forgotten American legends, and the Ghost Bride of Salem was one she couldn't ignore. Clara wasn't a believer in the supernatural, To her, ghost stories were just misunderstood history. But that changed the moment she stepped inside Whitfield Manor. The house seemed to breathe. Every floorboard groaned under her feet like it was alive. The wallpaper had turned yellow with age, yet faint writing could still be seen beneath the cracks. Scribbles of the same words repeated over and over again. "Is coming for me." Clara set up her recorder and whispered, "Eleanor Whitfield, if you can hear me, I just want to know the truth." At first, nothing. Then, a soft tap, like someone knocking gently from inside the walls. The air turned icy. Her breath clouded in front of her face, and faintly from the piano in the next room came the same haunting wedding melody Daniel had heard years before. She followed the sound into the ballroom. The piano played by itself, the keys pressing down with invisible hands. On the wall above it hung a wedding portrait, Eleanor and Thomas smiling, but something was wrong. Their eyes had been scratched out, and behind them in the photo, hidden in the darkness, a shadowy figure stood, a man with no face. The tape recorder hissed. Then a whisper, clear and broken, "Ha promised me forever." Clara's heart pounded. She grabbed her flashlight and turned toward the grand staircase. That's when she saw it, a faint trail of wet footprints, leading upward, as if someone had just walked in from the ocean. Every instinct told her to leave, but she couldn't. She had to know the truth. At the top of the stairs, she found a door half open, the master bedroom. Inside, the air was thick with salt and the faint smell of roses. The old mirror on the vanity was cracked down the center, splitting her reflection in two. And carved into the wooden frame were the words, "Till death do us part." The Clara turned on her camera and whispered, "Eleanor, what happened to you?" The mirror flickered, and for a split second, her reflection wasn't hers. It was a woman in a wedding gown, eyes hollow, mouth trembling. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then suddenly, the mirror shattered, glass exploding across the floor, through the shards. Clara saw something, a letter hidden beneath the vanity. She picked it up carefully. It was stained with age and water damage, but the words were still visible. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means the sea has taken me, but I will not rest beneath the waves. I made a vow, and I intend to keep it. When the clock strikes midnight, I will come back for you, no matter what I must become." Thomas Gray. Clara froze. It wasn't a love letter. It was a warning. Lightning flashed outside the window. Thunder roared. And suddenly, the piano downstairs began playing again. Louder, faster, chaotic. She ran down the stairs, but the house had changed. The walls were dripping with seawater. The air echoed with distant church bells. And in the middle of the ballroom stood a wedding altar, glowing faintly under the stormlight. Eleanor stood before it, her back to Clara, her gown soaked, her veil torn, her hands trembling as she clutched a bouquet of dead roses. When Clara whispered her name, Eleanor turned, her face pale as porcelain, her eyes glowing faintly blue like the ocean at night. "He's coming," she said softly. "He never broke his vow." The floorboards shook, the piano crashed into the wall, and from the shadows behind Eleanor, something began to rise. A black, dripping figure in a sailor's coat, its eyes hollow voids, its face barely human. It reached out with decayed hands, whispering for eternity. The lights burst. Clara screamed. The camera fell to the floor, recording the last seconds of chaos. A bride in white and a ghost groom rising from the dark, their hands touching for the first time in 100 years. When police found Clara's car outside the estate the next morning, the engine was still running. Her camera was recovered from the manor steps, waterlogged and broken. Only one frame survived, a photograph of the ballroom, and two faint silhouettes standing at the altar, hand in hand, as if the wedding had finally begun. The storm had passed, but Salem was not at peace. The Whitfield Manor, now cordoned off by the police, loomed like a wound on the landscape, a black silhouette against the gray morning sky. But for those who lived nearby, The nightmare had only just begun. Fishermen along the coast reported seeing a man in an old-fashioned sailor's coat walking along the shore at midnight. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and wherever he stepped, the tide would rise unnaturally high, as if pulled by his grief. They said he carried something in his hand, a silver ring glinting faintly under the moonlight. He never spoke. But every time someone called out to him, a whisper came with the wind. "I'm coming for my bride." The story unfolds 2 weeks after Clara's disappearance. Paranormal investigator Ethan Ward arrived in Salem. He had studied Clara's research for years. Her notes, her voice recordings, and her camera footage from Whitfield Manor. The last thing the camera captured was the faint sound of a heartbeat, and then silence. Ethan didn't believe in ghosts either, not until that night. He entered the manor just as the clock struck 12. The doors creaked open by themselves, and the faint melody of a piano floated through the halls. The scent of salt water lingered in the air. He turned on his flashlight, his voice steady but unsure. "Eleanor Whitfield, Thomas Gray, I know your story. I'm here to put you both to rest." For a long moment there was only silence. Then, the mirror on the wall rippled as if it were made of liquid. A figure appeared within its depths, a man drenched and pale, his mouth barely moving as he whispered, "Rest." "There is no rest, only the vow." The reflection flickered, and suddenly Ethan was standing in a different time. The manor was alive again. Candles lit, flowers fresh, and a wedding in progress. Guests smiled, laughter filled the air, and at the altar stood Eleanor, radiant in her white gown. Beside her, Thomas Gray, the sea captain, held her hand. Ethan realized he wasn't seeing the past, he was inside it. A vision replaying itself endlessly, trapped in time. As the priest spoke, the doors burst open. A messenger ran in, shouting, "The storm has taken his ship! The mariner's vow has sunk!" Gasps filled the chapel. Eleanor's face went pale as the ring slipped from her hand. Thunder roared, and the candles blew out. Everything went black, except for Eleanor, standing frozen at the altar, tears streaming down her face. And then the scene shattered. Ethan was back in the present, on his knees, the manor dark again. But the air was different now, colder, heavier. From the corner of the room, he heard a sound, slow footsteps, dragging, wet. He turned his flashlight toward the sound. There stood Thomas Gray, or what remained of him. His skin was pale as bone, water dripping from his clothes, his eyes glowing with sorrow and rage. Around his neck hung the remains of a wedding ring, rusted and broken. "You promised," Thomas rasped, voice echoing like the sea through a shell. "You promised we would never be apart." Ethan tried to step back, but his feet felt glued to the floor. He raised his recorder, whispering, "Thomas, Eleanor's gone. You both need to move on." The ghost's expression twisted. "Gone? No, she waits. Always waiting. The sea took me, now it will take her." The walls began to shake. Windows shattered. Salt water poured from the ceiling, as if the ocean itself had found its way inside. And then Ethan saw her, Eleanor, standing at the top of the staircase, her wedding gown flowing like mist. Her eyes were full of pain. "Thomas, please let it end." But the ghost captain reached out, his voice breaking. "You made a vow, and vows are forever." Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the entire room. Ethan screamed as the two spirits collided, their forms twisting, merging, the air filling with the sounds of crashing waves and broken vows. The manor trembled violently. Paintings fell, the floor cracked open, and for a moment, it felt as though the sea itself had swallowed the entire house. Then, silence. When Ethan woke, he was lying outside on the wet grass. Whitfield Manor stood before him, half submerged in water. In the upstairs window he saw them, a bride and groom dancing slowly under the moonlight. The melody of their wedding song drifted faintly through the air. He turned off his camera, whispering, "The wedding never ended, it never will." And as he walked away, the church bells rang once more, not from the chapel, but from deep beneath the ground, where the sea and the dead now shared one eternal vow. The ocean never sleeps, and since the night Whitfield Manor drowned, Salem had not seen a single calm tide. Waves now rose higher than the lighthouse, crashing against the cliffs as if something deep below was restless, alive. Fishermen began vanishing one by one. Boats were found adrift near the rocks, ropes snapped clean through, decks drenched in salt and blood. Locals whispered that the sea was claiming its debt, that the ghost bride and her drowned husband had awakened something older, darker. And then came the song. It began as a faint hum drifting from the harbor at night, a woman's voice, low and sorrowful, singing an unfinished wedding hymn. Every time the melody echoed across the waves, another man was found dead by dawn, eyes open, mouth full of seawater. The newspapers called it the Salem drowning mystery, but Ethan Ward knew better. He had seen the truth inside Whitfield Manor, the wedding that never ended. Now the vow was spreading. The haunting returns 3 months later. Ethan returned to Salem's coast. He wasn't the same man anymore. His eyes were hollow from sleepless nights, his dreams filled with waves crashing inside church walls, and the image of a bride reaching for him through the dark. He'd tried to move on, but the vow wouldn't let him. Everywhere he went, he heard that melody. In the rustle of trees, in the hum of streetlights, even in the rain tapping against his window. He knew Eleanor was calling him, or warning him. That night, a terrible storm struck Salem. Ethan drove to the harbor, recording every sound. Lightning lit up the coast. And there, in the middle of the ocean, stood something impossible. A church steeple, rising from the waves, covered in barnacles and seaweed. The drowned chapel of Salem, the place where Eleanor and Thomas were meant to be wed. The sea had brought it back. Ethan waded through the freezing water, clutching his recorder, whispering into the wind. "If you're still out there, Eleanor, please, show me." The sea answered with silence. Then, faintly, the toll of a bell. He turned toward the sound. A figure was standing in the surf, a woman in a soaked wedding gown, her veil dragging in the waves. Eleanor. She looked as beautiful as she was tragic, her pale face glistening with seawater, her lips trembling as she whispered, "He's not gone. He's never gone." Lightning flashed, and behind her, the water boiled. Something vast rose from the deep, not human anymore. Thomas Gray, the sailor who had defied death, his face eroded by the ocean, eyes glowing like lanterns beneath the waves. He moaned, voice echoing like thunder, "The sea keeps its promises." The tide surged forward, dragging Ethan under. He fought to breathe as icy water filled his lungs. Through the chaos, he saw visions. The night Thomas's ship sank, the storm tearing the mast apart, Thomas sinking beneath the waves with the wedding ring still in his hand. He had made a vow to return, and the ocean had heard him. It gave him back, but not as a man. Ethan reached the surface, gasping, clinging to a broken beam. The church bells rang again, louder now, shaking the entire coast. And then he saw it. Hundreds of faces beneath the waves. Drowned sailors, brides, lovers, all victims of broken vows, all rising to the surface as the curse spread. The sea had become a graveyard, and it was hungry. The curse spreads. By morning, the storm had ended, but Salem was gone. Half the town had been swallowed by the tide, and where Whitfield Manor once stood, there was only ocean. Reporters swarmed the area, calling it a natural disaster, but the survivors spoke in whispers, of church bells beneath the water, of a bride seen walking the shoreline, and of a man in a sailor's coat watching from the waves. Ethan barely made it out alive. He watched from the cliffside as the ocean glowed faintly blue in the moonlight, and the melody returned, that same sorrowful wedding hymn. He turned on his recorder one last time. His voice trembled. "This isn't a haunting. It's a resurrection. The sea remembers every promise ever made, and every one ever broken." The wind rose around him, and he could swear he heard Eleanor's voice again, "Till death do us part." Then, faintly, the whisper of Thomas followed, Death was never the end. Ethan dropped the recorder as the waves reached his feet. The tide pulled him slowly toward the edge, as if the ocean itself wanted him to join the eternal wedding beneath its surface. He looked back one last time, and there, reflected in the water, stood a bride and groom hand in hand, smiling faintly through the mist. And when the waves finally closed over him, Salem's coast fell silent once more. Only the sea remained, endless, watchful, waiting. The sea was calm that night, too calm. The wind had died, the gulls had vanished, and the moon hung above the ruins of Salem like a single, unblinking eye. Where the town once stood, there was only endless water and silence. But deep beneath the surface, something moved. In the cold darkness, among the wrecks of ships and drowned stones, a faint light shimmered, soft, golden, like candlelight in a church. And within that glow stood a wedding altar, untouched by time, covered in coral and seaweed. Two shadows stood before it, a bride and a groom hand in hand. Their faces were pale and ghostly, yet peaceful. Eleanor Whitfield and Captain Thomas Gray, finally together. But this was no heaven. This was their vow made real, eternal, unbroken, and inescapable. Ethan's final descent above. A small dive boat drifted near the old Salem coast. Inside it sat Ethan Ward, pale and trembling, his camera and recorder sealed in waterproof casings. He'd survived the flood, barely, but his mind had never escaped it. Every night he heard the same voices. The bride calling his name, the groom whispering his own vows through the crashing of waves. Tonight, he had come to end it, one way or another. He checked his oxygen tank, took a deep breath, and dove into the black water. As he descended, the light from the surface faded away, replaced by a faint blue glow from below. It grew brighter with every meter he sank. The ocean floor pulsed with life, or something pretending to be alive. Then he saw it, the underwater chapel. Every detail of Eleanor's old wedding hall was here. Pews, chandeliers, and an altar wrapped in seaweed and bone. Ghostly candles burned with blue fire, and at the center stood Eleanor herself, her wedding gown floating gently like silk in the current. When she turned to him, her voice echoed through the water, clear and haunting. "You shouldn't have come, Ethan. The vow doesn't end with us." Thomas appeared beside her, his hands skeletal, his eyes hollow but burning with emotion. "You sought truth, and truth is what you'll become." Ethan tried to speak, but the water pressed against his lungs. He held up his recorder, the red light blinking weakly, and gasped, "Why me? Why call me?" Eleanor's expression softened. "Because you listened, you believed, and the sea rewards devotion." Thomas raised his hand, and suddenly the water around Ethan boiled with energy. Shadows circled him, dozens of faces, hundreds, the souls of all those who had drowned in Salem's cursed tide. Their voices joined together in a slow, mournful chant. Forever bound by vow and sea, Ethan's heart pounded as the chapel began to tremble. The coral cracked, the candles flared brighter, and the entire sea floor shifted like a living creature. The wedding bells rang, deep, metallic, echoing through the abyss. Thomas took Eleanor's hand. Their eyes met, and for the first time in a century, they smiled. "Now," Eleanor whispered, "the wedding can begin." The ocean erupted with light. Beams of gold and blue spiraled upward, reaching all the way to the surface. From the cliffs above, locals who still remained in Salem saw the sea glowing like a second sunrise. And faintly beneath the roar of the waves, they heard church bells. The legend lives on weeks later. A fishing vessel found Ethan's boat drifting near the coast, empty. Inside, there was only his waterproof camera. The footage was short, barely a minute long. It showed a blurry image of two figures standing before an altar under the sea, their faces calm, their hands entwined. The final frame froze on Ethan's face, eyes wide, staring at something unseen behind the lens. Then a faint whisper, captured clearly before the feed cut out, "Till death do us part," and after. The footage was archived, dismissed as a hoax, and forgotten. But every year, on the anniversary of Salem's drowning, strange things happen along the coast. Wedding veils wash ashore soaked in salt and blood. Fishermen hear bells beneath the water, and sometimes, when the fog is thickest, two ghostly figures are seen walking the shoreline, a bride and her sailor, forever bound by love and the curse of the sea. They say if you stand too close and whisper your lover's name into the tide, you'll hear a voice whisper it back, but it won't be your lover. It'll be Eleanor Whitfield, the Ghost Bride of Salem, inviting you to join her wedding beneath the waves. Love is eternal, but so is the ocean that drowned it.